Welcome to our chat with Chris Fox, and I'll introduce you to him in a minute to talk about where we are on COP26. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Professor Tansy Whalen. I am the founder and run the NYU Stern Center for Sustainable Business. We're delighted to have our NYU Stern and NYU alums, students, faculty, and others here with us today. Our agenda, as you can see from the slide, is we'll have Chris present. We'll have a moderated Q&A. Please, during his presentation, feel free to enter into the chat your questions, and I'll keep track of those and ask him those questions when he's finished with his presentation. And then we were going to go into breakout networking so that practitioners and students and faculty and others can have an opportunity to engage. It's an important 2 weeks right now for our planetary history. We have, in the middle of the 2 weeks, we had the Planet Action Tracker announce that if we looked at the current commitments and the sort of vague statements about implementation, we're still looking at 2.7 degrees increase by 2100. So clearly not on a path where we can reduce and mitigate the really serious implications of climate change. So big red card thrown into the negotiations and discussions at COP26. At the same time, and we'll hear about this from Chris, we've seen some very serious, exciting commitments. Balanced by, a lot of skepticism, and particularly from young people. And we see a lot of young people out there really playing an activist role to take charge of their future, and terrific to see their engagement and them pushing us to do better. A little plug for our Center for Sustainable Business. As you know, our focus is really on helping current and future business leaders embed sustainability core to business strategy. We're pleased to announce the release of a new case study looking at Engine Number One's board takeover focused on Exxon, where for both climate reasons, climate transition reasons, and financial and governance reasons, they were able to negotiate and navigate a shift to bring more climate savvy board members to the Exxon board. So we're excited about that. We'll be sending you a link to that after the talk here today. So now I'm pleased to introduce you to Chris Fox, who is Senior Director of the Investor Network at Ceres. He'll tell you a bit about Ceres, but led by Mindy Luber, it's an incredibly important organization that has worked really effectively with investors and corporates to shift their practices around sustainability, doing a lot around proxy voting and many different things. And again, you'll hear a little bit about them from Chris. And his work on the Investor Network is focused on accelerating global investor action to tackle climate change. He's been with Ceres since 1997. Congratulations, Chris. And prior to that, he worked at the Heinz Family Foundation. He was the co-founder of the Center for Environmental Citizenship. So without further ado, I'm really thrilled to have you, Chris. Thank you so much for taking the time during this busy week, and I'd like to turn it over to you.
Thanks so much. Great to be with you all. Look forward to your questions afterward, and I'll keep my remarks as brief as I can. There are some slides, so if we could turn to those, that'd be great. But look forward to learning from you and having the dialogue afterward. So I titled this The Road from Glasgow, but I think we really should think about it as the road through Glasgow. This is not really the stopping point. It's much more of a turning point. And I think we'll see a lot of acceleration of momentum coming out of Glasgow and the recognition that this is the decisive decade for tackling climate. So, but really what I was asked to talk about is more the implications for investors and businesses. And there really were some dramatic announcements in the last 2 weeks. So let's go to the next slide. I'll just preview here my outline of my remarks here, just brief background on Ceres, and then we'll dig in specifically on COP26 and then turn to questions. So next slide. You can go to ceres.org for ceres.org for more information on us, but we're a nonprofit founded in 1989. We've been mobilizing investors and businesses on sustainability issues for those 32 years now. And when I first started at Ceres, we were focused on corporate sustainability reporting, and that was a radical idea at the time, which is kind of laughable now, given how mainstream sustainability reporting is. So I often feel like what we do at Ceres is turn radical ideas into mainstream ideas, and I think we'll see that happening with some of the climate discussions that have been happening as well. And when we first started working on climate change in 2002, we said it was a financial risk that every investor should address, and we were laughed out of the room by various big mainstream investors saying, "Oh, we don't focus on environmental issues. You know, we only work on financial risk issues and corporate governance issues." But we then came back and kept reminding them that this is a financial risk and it's a huge opportunity. And so once we translated into investor terminology of risk and opportunity, then we were able to get traction, and we built the Ceres Investor Network, which I was the first staffer on back in 2003. We had 10 investors launching it with 600 billion. Now we have more than 200 investors with something like 47 trillion in combined assets. So we've seen tremendous growth and just mainstreaming of the idea that climate risk is investment risk. That's what BlackRock CEO Larry Fink said at the start of 2021. So we're also working on water. We're working on issues related to climate change, like agriculture, forests, and many issues related to inequitable workplaces, and increasingly looking at kind of just and inclusive economies and issues of climate justice as well. Some of the connections there. So, and overall, we've just sensed that a lot of corporate leaders that want to do the right thing on sustainability have complained that their investors are too short term, and there's a lot of outdated capital market systems that inhibit corporate progress on sustainability. So we've been increasingly taking a look at financial regulators and some of the standard setters, and that's a whole other work stream. But for the purposes of this, I'll just dive right into the next slide, please. The road through COP26, the 26th conference of the parties to the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. That's why it's COP26. I've been to 4 of them. My first one was back in 2009 in Copenhagen. President Obama got the nations of the world to finally agree that we were all in this together and we needed a global agreement. Obviously, that wasn't reached until Paris in 2015. And the Paris Agreement, most people have heard of it. Not a lot of people have read it. So there's a link in there to it. One of the key elements of the Paris Agreement is obviously this idea of ratcheting up ambition at regular intervals. So this year is the first time that nations were expected to submit stronger national climate plans, or NDCs, and we'll get into that in a minute. And then another big change that happened starting in Paris was, instead of just thinking this as a government meeting, businesses, investors, civil society, cities, a whole range, faith institutions, colleges, universities showed up, and it became not just one conference, but it became literally hundreds of conferences happening in the same place at the same time, recognizing that governments can't solve this problem alone. We need all of society, every sector of the economy needs to transform. So I think Paris really put in motion what we've seen. So over the last 6 years, there's just been dramatic increase in climate awareness and leadership in the private sector. I think a lot of you probably have seen that in your own careers. Next slide, please. So yeah, the Paris Agreement context is important because one of the key goals in the Paris Agreement is to limit warming to well below 2 degrees, pursue efforts to limit it to 1.5 degrees. And what I was saying about ideas going from radical to mainstream, the 1.5 degree target back in Paris was pushed by the most vulnerable nations. Like a lot of the low-lying island nations were demanding that warming be kept to 1.5 because that has a dramatic difference in terms of sea level rise and impact on their countries. And the Paris Agreement text reflects how there wasn't quite agreement on 1.5. What you're going to see after COP26 is everybody agrees on 1.5. That's the goal. And that has meant that governments need to increase their ambition as well as the private sector. So aligning with 1.5 is the new normal. is one key insight I think that is coming out of COP26. And that means net zero by 2050. So that's what the IPCC has called for. You've got the IPCC report in 2018. Just the quote there is, in model pathways with no or limited overshoot of 1.5 degrees Celsius, global net anthropogenic CO2 emissions declined by about 45% from 2010 levels by 2030, reaching net zero around 2050. So that's the language that was negotiated by all of the scientists of the world through the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, and every government of the world signed off on that language. So that's also a new normal, is that the world needs to cut emissions by about half by 2030. So 8 years left. Clock is ticking. That sense of urgency, and let's stop talking about net zero by 2050 is what I'm hearing a lot from the kind of leaders in the private sector. Let's talk about what we're doing in terms of our ambition for 2030 and even 2025. So getting shorter term, one well-known billionaire climate activist, hedge fund guy, Chris Hone, Children's Investment Foundation in London, said anything that a private sector entity says beyond 2025 is greenwashing. So that gives you a sense of some of the controversy that surrounds how urgent, and how kind of dire the situation is, that people want to see the private sector step up by 2025. They don't want to hear about 2050, and some people don't even want to hear about 2030. So that's what we'll get into the controversies maybe in some of the questions. But the IEA did a net zero roadmap. I recommend that to people. That came out in May. In terms of energy sector transformation, it's one of the best documents I've seen in terms of what are the milestones you need to hit to actually achieve net zero by 2050. And the International Energy Agency has been heavily dominated by fossil fuel oriented countries, companies for a long time. This study says from today, in order to hit net zero by 2050, there can be no investment in new fossil fuel supply projects, and no further final investment decisions for new unabated coal plants. By 2035, there should be no sales of new internal combustion engine passenger cars, and by 2040, the global electricity sector should have achieved net zero. So this is a very powerful messenger, the IEA, within the kind of mainstream halls of government and business, saying that you shouldn't be investing in fossil fuel supply, which is totally radical concept that only Greenpeace activists were saying maybe 5-10 years ago. But now the IEA is saying it, and that's a dramatic shift. So let's just, in the interest of time, keep going through here. The basic question of COP26 is, will the governments that submit their nationally determined contributions, NDCs, be submitting ambitious enough NDCs to limit warming to achieve the goals of Paris, which is obviously the stretch goal was 1.5. So as you heard at the start, the Climate Action Tracker, you can go to the next slide. The Climate Action Tracker is one of the most trusted sources on this topic. The IEA also put out an assessment, and the UN itself puts out assessments on this. But if you look at all of the targets for 2030, just those if you don't count the net zero by 2050 pledges, the world gets to 2.4 degrees Celsius warming, which is dangerous. And the IPCC report has said limiting warming to 1.5 reduces the risk, reduces human suffering, makes it much more possible to adapt. And then as you get, every degree of a degree matters. So every bit of warming matters. But so the Climate Action Tracker reviews all these. You see only a few of them are deemed acceptable. The US target is not really praised, but if we can actually cut US emissions by 50 to 52% by 2030, which is the Biden administration goal, that puts us on the path to 1.5, but we're not quite there. And then there's some countries that actually didn't submit any enhanced NDCs, and some actually went backwards. So the Paris Agreement calls for a progression in ambition each time, every 5 years. And so that's the ratchet mechanism that is starting to work, but it's not completely working. The optimistic scenario that Climate Action Tracker uses is if the net zero pledges are delivered upon. So if all the nations that have pledged net zero by 2050, or in the case of China, it's 2060, or in the case of India, it's 2070, then we would get to 1.8 degrees Celsius, which is within striking distance of the 1.5 degree goal. So overall, though, I felt like a lot of people had dismissed 1.5 degrees as impossible and just decided that 2 degrees was the more realistic, sort of serious person would say, oh, yeah, we'll limit to 2. But there's now evidence that we can actually get warming under 2 with current pledges, but it's a huge amount of work. And there's a lot of if nations will actually achieve their net zero goals. So next slide. So the first thing to look at, I think businesses and investors are obviously looking closely at what the governments of the world are enacting in terms of policies. And a lot of people, have a clear understanding of climate change as a physical risk. Obviously, anyone in the New York area knows that. And, all over the country, all over the world, there's physical impacts of climate change. But what we found when we talk to investors and businesses is they're much more interested in what are the policy transition risks related to new laws and regulations, and how does that affect, in industry sectors. There's differential risks for different companies depending on how they're positioned, all that stuff that you would study in a business school. So, the first thing to look at is what have the governments of the world actually committed to. The COP26 decision is not yet out, so it's being negotiated in the final hours now. You can follow all the news sites for kind of live updates, but the expectation is it'll go into tomorrow. Most of these COPs don't end on Friday like they're scheduled to. They usually end on Saturday. Some have gone into Sunday. But there's a draft linked there, and you can see some of the text. And the G20 came out with a declaration on October 31st that I think is a good predictor of what some of the language will be. The NDCs, and the net zero targets are covering something like, net zero targets now cover something like 90% of global emissions. And all G20 nations have now set net zero targets. There's a great WRI, World Resources Institute analysis linked there. And just a word on the US, everyone knows the infrastructure legislation has passed. Biden's planning to sign it on Monday. And the remaining question obviously is about the Build Back Better Act and the huge amount of climate investment in that bill, 555 billion in climate related investments. We've seen some of the businesses that we work with willing to speak out in favor of passage of that bill. And we're mobilizing investors and businesses now to talk about how, the infrastructure package is a good first step, but we need, in order to achieve our climate and economic goals, we need to pass the Build Back Better Act through the budget reconciliation. So we'll see if Senator Manchin and all the, kind of back and forth in Congress leads to that bill actually getting passed. But Speaker Pelosi went to COP26 earlier this week and said that she would bring it up for a vote next week. So this is a very live moment and could be the biggest single piece of climate legislation ever passed in the US. So at Ceres, we focus on not just working with businesses and investors on their own practices and their own policies, but what role they can play as, advocates for policy. And when Trump withdrew from the Paris Agreement, and that was done in the start of his term in 2017, he cited its impact on jobs and the US economy as why it was a good idea to leave the Paris Agreement. And then we flip that on its head and say, it's actually imperative for the US to maintain its competitive advantage in a carbon constrained world that we invest in climate solutions, clean energy, that will position US businesses to thrive in the global clean energy markets of the future. So that's the sort of debate that we'll, I'm sure, hear again as that bill comes to a vote. And then the US and China just made a very significant announcement that China would, for the first time, address methane pollution, which China had never said they would address before. And that's really important in terms of short-term impacts on warming to control methane. The US and EU managed to persuade 100 governments. It's been growing, the numbers, but the global methane pledge was announced. And then there's also 100 plus governments that the UK government, as the host country for COP26, was able to recruit into a Glasgow declaration on reversing deforestation, and there's some concern about will this actually be followed through, but for the first time Brazil was involved, and China actually signed on to the deforestation. So that was a really major sign of progress. So let's move on to the next category of commitments. I know there's a lot of information coming at you, but it really has been remarkable to see in the past 2 weeks what not just governments are committed to, but now you've got businesses, like I said, adopting 1.5 degrees as the new North Star, the new normal, and that it's a new expectation that every business will set a science-based target aligned with 1.5 degrees. And that's more than 1,000 companies worldwide have done that. The Science-Based Targets Initiative is coordinated with the UN and with some of our partners. Ceres is a founding member of the We Mean Business Coalition that I put a link at the bottom. There's just too many announcements to even share. One that got some press earlier this week, you've got Ford and General Motors, Mercedes, Volvo saying we're gonna, and a whole range of governments, including California, but not the US federal government, but a whole host of governments and businesses saying we will end the sale of internal combustion engines by 2035 in leading markets, and then by 2040 worldwide. So that, message that the future of transportation is electric has come through, and I think that'll create, a pretty powerful market signal to help the electric vehicle and charging infrastructure industry. And so I could go on and on about basically every sector is now figuring out how it can decarbonize, including some of the more challenging sectors. The World Economic Forum has made some important announcements. There's literally dozens listed there at the bottom. But given I focus on investors, I spend a little more time looking at that. And we've been working with some of our investor members who were attending COP26. And so if we go to the next slide, we'll just do a quick run through of some of the finance sector investor commitments. And when people talk about COP26 and finance, you have to be careful. Are they talking about public finance, meaning government funds, which, the debate there has largely been about the pledge that the developed countries made back in Copenhagen in 2009, that developed countries would step up financial flows. $100 billion per year was the goal for developing countries starting in 2020 and running each year through 2025. So 500 billion in total. The developed countries before COP26 said they weren't going to achieve that goal by 2020, and that has caused major tension with the developing countries. But that with new commitments, they might be able to get to the 500 billion over the whole period, but it just wouldn't be flowing exactly on the time frame that they had hoped. So there's a lot of distrust that is trying to get solved right now through these final hours of negotiations. But don't have time to get into all the public finance stuff, but there's been a huge amount of work to try to deliver on that. And then all the government leaders, whenever they talk about finance, say, look, to really solve the climate crisis, we need to shift trillions of dollars from fossil fuels to clean technology. So that there's a new roadmap that came out saying private sector financial institutions could provide up to 70% of the financing needed. So there's a new report there that has some good data on the different investment opportunities. So next slide. And obviously 90% of the emissions growth is going to come from developing countries and emerging economies. And so figuring out how to get not just more private capital flowing, but getting it flowing to the right places is key. So for example, India and solar. I mean, India has set huge goals around solar and renewables, and yet it's challenging for some major institutional investors to figure out how to invest in India. And so overcoming those challenges is one thing that development banks and other public finance institutions can do by doing de-risking and other things. So I've committed to end at 12:30, so I'm going to run through this really quickly. Sorry about that. But the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero was just launched. Ceres was involved in a lot of the planning of that. There's banks, insurers, there's asset owners such as the big pension funds, there's asset managers like BlackRock and Vanguard and State Street that all now committed to set targets to achieve net zero by 2050 or sooner. And that, in and of itself is, a source of tension and kind of concern within climate activist community. There's been a sense that this might be greenwashing because it's about 2050, but the way we look at it is it's the starting line and it's aspirational, and now they need to set interim targets that are science-based for 2025, for 2030, and disclose their progress on an annual basis. So there's a set of commitments around disclosure and assurance and verification that we can get into in Q&A if you want. But the Secretary General just yesterday gave a speech where he mentioned this is what he expects. He expects not just every country and city, but every company, every financial institution to radically, credibly, and verifiably reduce their emissions and decarbonize their portfolios starting now. So this is a fascinating example of the Secretary General, who usually just tries to influence governments, projecting his reputational power on to other sectors. And that kind of international peer pressure will ratchet up ambition, I think, in the private sector around net zero. And again, net zero is the new normal now in the finance sector as well. Let's go to the next slide. So the sub alliances are all listed there. Ceres has banks that are members of the Ceres company network. We have BlackRock and State Street and others as members of the Ceres Investor Network. And then we've launched with our colleagues in Europe, Australia, Asia, the Paris Aligned Investment Initiative. That has an asset owner commitment. There's a specific net zero asset managers initiative for anyone who is on this call who might work for an asset manager. That, if you haven't learned about, happy to set up a time to talk further about that. We co-convene those two initiatives with some of our international partners, and then the UN itself convenes an asset owner initiative. Next slide. The way that Ceres participated this year, we chose to be virtual because of COVID concerns. We just decided not to travel, but we did send a delegation of investors, businesses, a few of our board members, and one of our board members is just an example of how we work with investors. Betty Yee is the California State Controller. She's on the board of CalPERS and CalSTRS, the two largest public pension funds. So she spoke on a panel with a number of other investors, but was trying to deliver this message. We had recruited 733 investors with more than $52 trillion in assets to issue this global investor statement to governments, and it had some specific policy recommendations in it. Next slide. So this is my final slide. The point I made at the start about how we really need to think about the road through Glasgow. No one's going to solve the climate crisis in a 2-week conference. So this is a key moment, a key deadline for countries and companies and financial institutions to step up ambition. They've stepped up somewhat. It's not enough. There is progress, though. It is possible to limit warming to 1.5. We do need to cut emissions in half globally by 2030. So it's a crucial moment these next 8 years. And what we've seen, though, is the Paris Agreement is working in the sense of creating this positive ambition loop that once governments say they want to increase their ambition, then businesses and investors say, we will too, and we'll help you manage the risks of climate change, but we also will position ourselves to capture the opportunities, wind and solar, electric vehicles, storage, hydrogen, I can go on and on. I mean, there's just major opportunities. And for the first time ever, there was a US Treasury Secretary at a COP, and Janet Yellen gave a speech about public and private finance flowing, but made the point that addressing climate is the greatest economic opportunity of our time. So a great issue for business school students and alumni to be focused on, and really appreciate your time. Last slide just has my contact information. Look forward to the questions. Feel free to reach out by email or LinkedIn. Look forward to being in touch. Back to you.
Great, Chris. Thank you so much for that comprehensive overview, and the insights are really helpful. We have a lot of good questions. I'm going to go first. I'm going to pull together a couple of the finance questions. So one was, given the huge gap in financing needs, what are the institutions best placed to lead the financing efforts, and in particular engage the private sector? And then, hold on, let me give you another one too, which was, oops, where did it go? Why don't you go ahead and answer that one? But I had another, here we go, here it is. Do you think the majority of the financial community is rowing in unison towards net zero climate action, or is it still a few vocal leaders with most of the financial community still floating aimlessly, being a drag on it? Right, so I put those two questions together for you first.
Yeah, the turning point aspect of COP26 for finance was the leadership of, Mark Carney, the former governor of the Bank of England, and Mike Bloomberg. They're now co-chairing this Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero. So when you have 450 financial institutions, combined assets of 130 trillion, it really is like we've hit the tipping point. And sure, there's some that aren't yet committed to net zero, but when you have the three largest US asset managers, BlackRock, Vanguard, State Street, it's just become the new mainstream. And so now the hard work begins of how do you actually set a target. There's a lot of issues with data. How do you actually get the data about your portfolio? And then what's an appropriate interim target? And really, it doesn't matter if you decarbonize your own portfolio, to be honest. What matters is that we decarbonize the entire global economy. So a lot of smart investors are realizing they need to step up their engagement with companies. So you're seeing, like you cited at the start, the whole example with Exxon is a great example of institutional investors stepped up their engagement with Exxon and actually put climate competent boards on the board of Exxon using their power. I think sort of capitalists are awakening to their power in the capital system on this issue. And yet there's much more short-term ambition that's needed. So a lot of cynicism in the media and in NGOs about net zero by 2050. My advice to investors and businesses: talk more about 2025 and 2030 and lay out a climate action plan that's aligned with net zero, but show what you're doing in the short term to get there, not just talk about the long term. And then on the overall, where are we going to get the capital? I think that, that message is starting to get through, that it's not from governments, really. Governments have a role to play in terms of development banks, de-risking projects in developing countries and emerging economies where the capital is needed. BlackRock just did a good paper on that. It's on their website, BlackRock Investment Institute. Paul Bodnar is a really smart guy there who's worked at the State Department, thought a lot about this issue. There's a lot of investors that tell us we just can't find the projects that are at the scale that we need. We can't do deals that are below 100 million, for example. Or so some of these projects are too small scale. How do you kind of aggregate them in a way that allows larger investors to feel comfortable that they can meet their fiduciary duties, risk requirements, et cetera. And then, I would look at the IEA Net Zero Roadmap for more detail. And then GFANZ itself, the Glasgow Financial Alliance, released a net zero finance roadmap, which is good as well.
They did. It was rather vague. I looked to try to figure out what exactly it meant, and it was big picture stuff. But they do.
Yeah.
The
other group I would recommend is Climate Policy Initiative. Does really good work. They have a global landscape for climate finance that does an annual assessment of where we are, and we're about 600 billion a year now, according to them. When the IEA and others say we should be at 3 trillion, so we need to more than triple. So it's a huge opportunity for people who want to go into the general field of investment in clean energy or clean technologies, and you've seen the market valuations of companies like Tesla and now Rivian, and just incredible wealth creation opportunities for smart investors and business leaders.
So we have a lot of questions, so I'm going to see if we can get through them with brief answers. So one is a quick sort of finance related question around techniques. So in the good old days, 70s, 90s, leasing and lease financing were significant techniques for raising capital for growth markets. How might this logic or action path be repurposed for climate change financing? Any ideas on that?
I don't off the top of my head, but happy to ask my colleagues who've been working on. We've got some work happening around green bonds, and it's hard to say exactly what we as Ceres have done in that area, because I haven't personally done anything myself. So sorry. But
okay, no worries.
Happy to refer to a colleague if you want to follow up with me by email. Yeah.
Yep. So there's a couple of questions around assurance, both in terms of accountability on the governmental net zero side, but also, of course, TCFD and sort of the shifts that we're seeing, the announcement by IFRS, et cetera. So if you can give any insights into both at the country and the business level, what we're seeing, where that's going to go.
Yeah, right. I didn't have time to get into the IFRS stuff, but the idea that financial regulators now are creating an international sustainability standards board is very significant. And by next year, we'll have some sort of climate disclosure standard, which we've been advocating for more than 20 years. We filed a petition with the Securities and Exchange Commission back in the 2000s asking for the SEC to mandate corporate climate disclosure. And later this year, under the Biden administration SEC, they have said they will release a rule. So look at how the SEC relates to the ISSB. That's going to be an important piece for the
future. That was a question raised, actually. Yeah.
Yeah, for the future of climate disclosure. And it gets very wonky very fast, but I'm trying to keep my answers short here. So, but yeah, on the verification piece, the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero is requiring reporting, requiring short-term targets, science-based. The Secretary General of the UN has said he's going to create a new expert group to scrutinize all of these, what he calls non-state actor net zero claims. And so yeah, expect more academics. Like there's great folks at Oxford doing work on net zero tracking and credibility. And everyone wants to ensure the integrity of these. And Ceres is very concerned about our own reputation because we're helping support 2 of these initiatives, and we want to make sure they're rigorous and require a lot of public disclosure.
Great, thank you. There are also a couple questions around the nexus between this work and gender and race and sort of justice, climate justice issues. And what do you see as was there any meaningful discussion and actions in this COP26, and where do you see that going?
Yeah, I think within the COP26 framework, there was a whole day on gender, and that the criticism of the COP leadership, for example, of the UK being heavily male. Ceres is led by Mindy Luber, and there's a whole sense that a lot of the government leaders are white, male, and stale, kind of, right? So like in their 60s, there was a great New York Times article about that, and how a lot of the climate activists in the streets are young and female. And so there's serious gender divides that need to be overcome, and we need to get many more women into the leadership roles in not just government, but business and investors. And then the climate justice issue is framed in multiple different ways, not just the environmental justice way that we think about it in the US with climate impacts hitting poor communities that are people of color predominantly, and then but the rich nations have caused this problem, and it's the poor nations that are going to suffer, and in many cases these poor nations have almost done nothing to cause the problem. So what is the proper role for rich nations in terms of providing payments, loss and damage? That's a huge debate that is very acrimonious. And then on the just transition issues related to workers and communities, the labor unions have been very active at COP about making sure that as we transition from fossil fuels to clean energy, we don't leave people behind, and we make sure that workers and communities are given subsidies or other opportunities in terms of new jobs outside of the fossil fuel sector.
Thank you. Another question around adaptation and resiliency, in addition to mitigation, some of that related to what you were just talking about, but more broadly, what were identified as the key gaps and sort of actions to take in terms of implementing against that?
Yeah, if you look at the draft decision that is being negotiated right now, the second item is adaptation, and then the third item is adaptation finance. And so we've seen, unfortunately, just to be blunt, very little interest in the investment community in investing in adaptation compared to investing in clean energy projects, and technologies like wind and solar that mitigate. But adaptation finance is what developing countries have been rightly demanding, and the COP26 text will come up with some sort of call to action there, urging not just the developed country governments to scale up adaptation finance, but also calling on private sector financial institutions to do more in that area. So we're already at the point where we're experiencing dangerous climate impacts, as we all know. And so with, I would imagine that that's going to become one of those new frontiers in investor and financial institution responses to climate is making sure that you have a climate resilience investment strategy as well as a clean technology investment strategy.
Great, thank you. So I'm going to lay out 3 final questions and then we'll move on. So one question was around asset managers and asset owners addressing net zero targets, the context of fiduciary duty requirements. Are we seeing, because in the past, fiduciary duty has been used as a shield against making these kinds of changes. So what are you seeing there? Secondly, where do you stand on offsets? There's a long, sort of complicated conversation around the role of offsets and how credible they are. And then you answer those. I had a third one, which I'm forgetting, but go ahead with those 2.
Yeah, I think once you had, BlackRock CEO Larry Fink saying climate risk is investment risk, and we have a fiduciary duty to address risk, it took away that fiduciary duty objection, basically, at least in the kind of popular investment debate. And the systemic risk of climate is now being understood. It's a global risk you can't diversify away from. So the only way to reduce the risk of climate change to your investments is to reduce the emissions that cause those risks, and then to obviously invest in adaptation. And so that you have to use your influence as an investor with the assets you own, whether it's companies or real estate or fixed income. So that's the shift, is that investors are now actually trying to solve the climate problem, which is a fundamental shift. It's hard to believe that wasn't on their minds 10, 20 years ago, but 10, 20 years ago, they just thought they could somehow manage the risks without actually tackling the climate problem itself. So there was a sense that, as an investor, all you had to do was think about the climate risk to your own portfolio, but you didn't have to proactively engage with companies or governments to reduce the overall risk to the economy. But with so many large investors, they own the whole economy in these passive index vehicles, et cetera. So that shift, I think, has been very powerful around fiduciary duty. The other question on offsets, we've got a policy on that within the Net Zero Asset Managers Initiative. If you go to netzeroassetmanagers.org, you can see in our Q&A section how we handle that. But we want the major focus to be on zero emissions, very little on net. There's, carbon removals is a huge big debate we can get into, but the limited use of high quality offsets only when you can't reduce emissions is the basic point that we are getting into. But we're trying to build out investor publications on that to educate people about that issue.
Great.
Might take up more time than we have to go into that more.
Sorry. While you're talking about
happy to follow up by email. Send me an email. I'm happy to send. Yeah.
Great. Thank you, Chris.
Yeah.
While we're speaking about tools, with businesses declaring emission targets, what are the resources you would point people to look at the specific steps they're taking, and associations that have been created to share those resources, ideas for goals for both companies, people that want to hold them accountable, but also companies who want to do this right?
Yeah, I think there would probably be 3 sources. For businesses overall, I think Science Based Targets Initiative and We Mean Business are 2 really good websites for you, and they're tracking with good amount of rigor what's going on in different sectors and specific companies. CDP has a great website as well with companies that are disclosing what they're doing. And then on the investor side, the very new movement of investors setting net zero targets is being coordinated by Net Zero Asset Managers, like I just said. So you can see the signatories there, and some of them are starting to submit interim targets, and those are fascinating to read. There's a progress report on the website there. They have a year from when they commit to submit their initial targets, and so a lot of them have just committed in the last 6 months. So they haven't yet released their initial targets. And then the Paris Aligned Investment Initiative is parisalignedinvestment.org, and that'll cover some of the asset owners. Some of the big funds like New York State and New York City pension funds with hundreds of billions of dollars in assets have committed to net zero by 2040. So,
Great.
But yeah, I hope this is helpful. Really enjoyed your questions. Great questions. And
Thank you, Chris. Really appreciate your time. We had a couple we didn't get to, but really thank you for your really interesting overview and also your insights for our NYU community. So thank you again.
yeah, thanks
And
for focusing on this. Business schools
yeah,
have tremendous power in our society and can help solve the climate problem. So really appreciate it.
thank you so much.
All right.
Great.